Okay, this video is How to Write Better, part number 9, and we're going to emphasize the work of Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer wrote quite a lot about how does a person become a better writer and what is a good book. For example, this is a picture of him in 1815. Schopenhauer, let me make this picture smaller here. He lived from 1788 to 1860. He was a brilliant guy. He could read in 6 different languages, and he had inherited money, so he didn't really have to work. So he had a lot of time to sit around reading and thinking. And he was the greatest philosopher in the history of Germany, but he couldn't get a job as a philosopher. And then when he briefly worked as a philosopher, he was outshadowed by Hegel. And previously, the big name in Germany before him was Goethe. And Goethe was more of a writer and a scientist. But so Schopenhauer always had a bit of a chip on his shoulder. He's kind of pissed off that he couldn't get more famous early in his life as a philosopher. And so he was very outspoken. His favorite books include Tristram Shandy by Lawrence Sterne. That's about the guy who most of the book occurs before he was born. So it's kind of a crazy book, but it's kind of funny. And it was brilliant for being written in the 1700s. And Don Quixote, for example. Okay, so he became a lonely old man. I think he had one child who died early, and so he never had any kids. He didn't marry. And he's this grouchy old genius. But I could relate to him in a way because he would sit there and he would try to really understand things. Oh, like here's one thing he said. He said that men seem to largely get their intellect from their mothers and their character from their fathers. And I thought about this and gee, my kids kind of got more influence from their mother than from me. Why can't they be more like me? And then I thought about it and I realized that you get the sperm from the father, the egg from the mother, and the DNA is in both of them, but the mitochondria come from the mother. So also the plasma membrane of the zygote, the egg, the cytoplasm. And I thought about this. At first I was sad, but then I realized if the mama is providing that additional genetic material, let's just say it's 2/3, then really she probably ought to be responsible for 2/3 of the kid's expenses, don't you think? Okay, anyways, Arthur Schopenhauer said, a happy life is impossible. The highest a man can achieve is a heroic life. Yeah, if you think about happiness, you'll end up being sad, but if you get moving on something you care about, you'll be happier. It is only in old age that intellectual men attain their sublime expression. Of all the intellectual faculties, judgment is the last to mature. Okay, so then now we'll start getting into his quotes about writing. A man who has not enough originality to think out a new title for a book will be much less capable of giving it new contents. Okay, yeah, so if they can't come up with good chapter titles either, the book probably stinks. Okay, Arthur Schopenhauer. True brevity consists in saying only what is worth saying while avoiding all that everyone can think for themselves. So reading his stuff, I think, really helped me a lot as a writer. The great writer writes the quintessence only, nothing that the reader would think for themselves. To use many words to communicate few thoughts is the unmistakable sign of mediocrity. To gather much thought into a few words stamps the man of genius. So what I would recommend if you're trying to become a better writer is to always try to write well, whatever you write. If you're writing an email, try to write it well. If you're making a report or a dictation in your field, whatever that might be, mine's medicine, I try to make my writing good because I feel like that way I'm at least practicing and maintaining quality to the extent that I can. Of course, each type of writing is very different, but if you're always trying to make it good, you keep good habits. You keep a good awareness of punctuation. Like, for example, in my medical reports, I use lots of semicolons because I found that's a good way to connect a bunch of information. Like, let's say I'm describing a tumor or something. Okay, only he who writes entirely for the sake of what he has to say writes anything worth writing. The greatest works of the greatest men of all time wrote when they had to write them for nothing or for a very small amount. Okay, so that's a good point too. A lot of the best books are self-published and they didn't really sell too many copies initially, if any. The best writers are those who have thought before they started writing. They are rare. He who writes for fools will find a large audience. It only takes a few pages to see the author's skill and intention. If the author does not quickly display some valuable information and only seems to be writing to fill up the page with words, then quickly throw the book into the garbage because time is too valuable to waste. You could tell usually on the first page if the author knows what they're doing. A good writer should have, something clever or funny or interesting or unique right there in the first page, or maybe they're playing games with fonts and a small paragraph to begin with. The typical rookie starts with a big bulky paragraph right at the beginning that makes you tired. You don't even want to read it. A great writer writes because he has something to say. He does not write for fame or money because he knows he will not get any. He writes for great men and for posterity because too few of his contemporaries will be able to follow his thoughts. He is like a man who knows the correct time, but it is of no use to him because everyone else is using a different clock. Okay, so that's been my experience too. And that's kind of like the Hollingsworth principle. Remember, we talked about an IQ range. If your IQ range in a subject is 30 points more than the other people on that subject, it's going to be difficult to communicate them. You almost have to dumb it down to their level in order to make it good. So what I'm basically saying is when somebody's writing a complex, sophisticated thing, it's like what Schopenhauer is saying. There's going to be a small audience for it. One simply has to think about what is the context of the situation that they're writing in. Okay, so the person writing a good book, he plans his book like an architect plans a building. He has really thought about the topic. He has conversed about the topic. He writes about his own thoughts and his own experience. He expresses in a fresh and forcible way. Okay, yeah, so that's a good book right there. Simplicity has always been held as a mark of truth. It is also a mark of genius. Yeah, so good writer, they just get right to the point. The object of science is to recognize the many in the one, to perceive the rules in any given example, and not to go on counting up facts ad infinitum. Okay, Schopenhauer continues. Since then, similes and metaphors are such a powerful engine of knowledge, it is a sign of great intelligence in a writer if his similes are unusual and at the same time to the point. Yeah, you can tell that's when a writer's good. If they're making metaphors and similes that surprise you and ring true, you're like, wow, this person's they got some useful information. A good work is doubly good if it is short. All right, Schopenhauer continues on writing. Students and learned persons of all sorts and every age aim as a rule at acquiring information rather than insight. Information is only a means of insight and of little value in itself. Yeah, that's true. So most grade school, high school, college is just memorizing stuff without really understanding the point of it. Good knowledge, when you're hanging around with a friend and we're talking about something you both care about, good knowledge is something that helps you to understand it. It's actionable knowledge that you can use it. Okay, Schopenhauer continues. True excellence can be attained only where the work has been produced for its sake alone. The truth is that the hobbyist treats his subject as an end, whereas the professional treats it merely as a means. The hobbyist is really in earnest about a matter and has a direct interest because he likes it and pursues it con amore. It is these hobbyists and not professional hirelings that have always done the greatest work. Now, I used to love reading this type of stuff from Schopenhauer because it would inspire me. I would be, for example, writing book chapters about diabetes. I'm a neuroradiologist. I'm not an endocrinologist. But what I recognized when I would go through all their literature and their textbooks is that none of them were addressing the key points. The guy Shulman out of Yale did some great work in diabetes. That guy deserves a Nobel Prize. But when I'm talking about the standard textbooks, and Roy Taylor did some great work, the English guy too. His paper's great, okay? And they both won the Banting Prize, okay? But in terms of the bread and butter textbooks and most of the papers, you don't ever get to this type of stuff. The great stuff comes from this type of perspective. The intellectual attainments of a man who thinks for himself resemble a fine painting, where the light and the shade are correct, the tone sustained, the color perfectly harmonized. It is true to life. On the other hand, the intellectual attainments of the mere man of learning are like a large palette, full of all sorts of colors which are at most systematically arranged, but are devoid of harmony, connection, or meaning. To think with one's own head is to aim at developing a coherent whole, a system, even if it is not a strictly complete one. Okay, so yeah, that's true. Somebody who just goes by the book really doesn't know much. The person who's dealt with it in real life and thought about it and had conversations about it and tried to figure it out. The really scientific thinker, although he has need of much knowledge and so must read a great deal, his mind is strong enough to master it all, to assimilate and incorporate it with the system of his thoughts, and to make it fit with the organic unity of his insight, which, though vast, is always growing. And the thinker stands in the same relation to the book philosopher as an eyewitness does to a historian. The thinker speaks from direct knowledge of his own. The thinker is like the man who has traveled to the other place and lived there for some time, whereas the book scholar has only read travel guides about the other place. And the man who thinks for himself can be easily distinguished from the book philosopher by the way he talks, by his marked earnestness and the originality, directness, and personal conviction that stamp all his thoughts and expressions. Whereas the book philosopher lets it be seen that everything he has is secondhand. The works of all truly capable minds are distinguished by a character of decision and definiteness, which means that they are clear. A truly capable mind always knows what it wants to express. The characteristic sign of a mind of the highest order is that it always judges at first hand. So yeah, basically, if you want to write anything that's of really high quality, you have to be enthusiastic about it. You have to seek true excellence. You have to learn from all the conventions and stuff, but trust your inner sense, your inner mind to produce good work. And you should have read the peripheral literature on it. You should have conversed with some other persons knowledgeable about it, and then you could do good work. Whereas when you just do conventional formatted stuff, it's usually going to be mediocre. Okay, Schopenhauer continues. Got no room here. What light is to the outer physical world, intellect is to the inner world of consciousness. Only where the intellect exceeds the measure needed for living does knowledge become an end in of itself. It is consequently a quite abnormal event if in some man's intellect it deserts its natural vocation, that of serving the will by perceiving mere relations between things, in order to occupy itself purely objectively. But it is precisely this which is the origin of art, poetry, and philosophy, which are therefore produced by an organ not originally intended for that purpose. For the intellect is fundamentally a hard-working factory hand, whom his demanding master, the will, keeps busy from morning till night. But if this hard-driven serf, the intellect, should once happen to do some work of its own, voluntarily, during his free time, on his own initiative, and without any object but the work itself, simply for its own satisfaction, then this is a genuine work of art. Indeed, if pushed to the maximum, a work of genius, such as purely objective employment of the intellect, as well as creating all artistic, all poetical, and all philosophical achievements of the higher kind, also creates all purely scientific achievement in general. Okay, so that's a great statement. He's basically saying the individual mind seeking truth and trying to understand something is what produces all the great works. And it doesn't come from professors working on their job. It doesn't come from a group of professors or so-called scientists. It comes from that individual desire. And you'll see that that's really pretty much the case. Great achievements. The individual has an idea. Yeah, they'll end up needing other people to help them a lot of times to work it all out, or to build a company and to build a product or a device. But it's that initial individual deep pursuit of a subject that leads to great work. Okay, Schopenhauer continues. Talent works for money and fame. The motive which moves genius to productivity is, on the other hand, less easy to determine. It isn't money, for genius seldom gets any. It isn't fame, because fame is too uncertain. It is rather an instinct of a unique sort of virtue, whereby the genius is impelled to express what he knows in enduring works without being conscious of any additional motivation. It takes place by and large with the same sort of necessity as a tree brings forth fruit. I thought that was a great line. So basically, a smart person just creates stuff because it's their nature to create stuff. And it's like a fruit tree makes fruit. I thought that was great. Okay, the genius has a greater gift of clarity of thought and knowledge that he wishes to give to the whole species. It is this that impels them to labor in solitude and to complete their work. Schopenhauer on writing continues. The growth of ideas rests at bottom upon simile, because ideas arise by a process of combining the similarities and neglecting the differences between things. So basically, this guy figured this out. That's how the brain works, by connecting new information to what we already know. Schopenhauer figured this stuff out back in like around 1800. I mean, Schopenhauer was a genius. Don't get me wrong, he was a crazy, bitter genius. All that is true. But the guy was a genius. Okay, intelligence in the strict sense of the word ultimately consists in a seizing of the relations between things. Yeah, that's how we learn a new thing. We connect it to what we already know. And a clear and pure grasp of the relations is all the more often attained when the comparison is made between cases that lie wide apart from one another and between things of quite a different nature. Okay, then he continues talking about scientific discovery. I'm going to get into a little bit more about what he said on writing, but some of the stuff fills the background. Because what I love about Schopenhauer is he wasn't talking about, trying to get an A on your high school essay. He was talking about how does somebody who's writing create a magnificent work that stands the test of time and that is worth looking at 100 years later. How does somebody do that? Where does that come from? And if you aspire to that, a greatness of something, you're much more likely to produce something that's high quality. Okay. Schopenhauer continues, as long as a relation is known to me, existing only in a single case, I have but an individual idea of it. In other words, only an intuitive knowledge of it. But as soon as I see the same relation in two different cases, I have a general idea of its whole nature, and this is a deeper and more perfect knowledge. Okay, since similes and metaphors are such a powerful engine of knowledge, it is a sign of great intelligence in a writer if his similes are unusual and at the same time to the point. Aristotle also observed that by far the most important thing for a writer was to have this power of metaphor, for it is a gift which cannot be taught, and it is a mark of genius. Okay, now here's what I think is one of the most useful lines coming up on how to write better from Schopenhauer. I think of this every day when I'm writing a report or anything, an email, anything. Good writing should be guided by the rule that a man can think only one thing clearly at a time. A man can think only one thing clearly at a time. And good writing should be guided by the rule. Okay, and therefore he should not be expected to think of two or even more at the same moment. So yeah, you gotta limit one thing to a sentence, and it can be a comparison, thing A is like thing B or is not like thing B. That's fine. It's still describing thing A in comparison to something. But when people start doing stuff like, for example, when I deal with residents, they should say central stenosis, let's say of a spine, is one sentence, and then foraminal stenosis is another sentence. If they combine the two, there is no central foraminal stenosis, that makes my head hurt. You don't want to combine two separate things in that way because it screws up. It makes the reader confused. Okay, but this is done when a writer breaks up his principal sentence into little pieces for the purpose of pushing into the gaps, thus two or three thoughts by way of parenthesis, thereby unnecessarily and wantonly confusing the reader. Yeah, you got to decrease the cognitive load on the reader to make the writing good. Okay, now Schopenhauer continues, an obscure and vague manner of expression is always a very bad sign. In 99% of cases out of 100, it comes from a vagueness of thought. And this almost always means that there is something wrong about the thought itself, that it is incorrect. Okay, Schopenhauer continues, genius can be defined as an exceptionally clear consciousness of things and therefore also of their antithesis and one's own self. If you want to earn the gratitude of your own age, you must keep in step with it. But if you do that, you will produce nothing great. Yeah, anybody that functions by popular standards is going to produce mediocrity. If you have something great in view, you must address yourself to posterity. Only then, to be sure, you will probably remain unknown to your contemporaries. You will be like a man compelled to spend his life on a desert island, and there toiling to erect a memorial, so that future seafarers shall know he once existed. A novel will be of a high and noble order, the more it represents the inner and the less it represents the outer life. Okay, well, what this reminds me of now, this next quote. So if that last quote was great, that if you write something of magnificent genius level, no one's going to look at it. And I used to laugh that like William Roberts, the genius pathologist of coronary artery disease, had like 10 views on his YouTube video. And then all this other crap will have a lot. Okay, and so now here's another great point. He says, a great novel has its emphasis on the inner life of the mind rather than action. And, perfect examples. Look at the old movies. It's a Wonderful Life with Jimmy Stewart. It's a magnificent movie because, it pulls your heartstrings, so to speak. Okay, and then same thing with a lot of those other old movies. Whereas the modern stuff, it's a bunch of crap, just a bunch of action scenes and sort of, really minimal vocabulary or emotion. Okay, the novel skill consists in setting the inner life in motion with the smallest possible array of circumstance, and the ration between the two provides a means for judging any novel of whatever kind, for it is this inner life that really excites our interest. The business of the novelist is not to relate great events, but to make small ones interesting. Tristram Shandy has indeed as good as no action at all, and there is not much in La Nouvelle Heloise by Rousseau, or in Wilhelm Meister by Goethe. Even Don Quixote has relatively little, and what there is very unimportant and introduced merely for the sake of fun. And these four are the best of all novels. Schopenhauer would read in 6 different languages and compare all the literature. Okay, Schopenhauer continues, always to see the general in the particular, that is the foundation of genius. Intellect is invisible to the man who has none. That's a great line. Intellect is invisible to the man who has none. All truths pass through 3 phases. First, they're ridiculed. Second, violently opposed. Then third, accepted as self-evident. Education perverts the mind because it does the opposite of the natural. It forces opinions and conclusions and ideas into our minds first and observations last. That is why so few men of learning have common sense, whereas it is quite common amongst the illiterate. Okay, Schopenhauer continues on genius here. In genius, knowledge becomes the main thing, the aim of the whole life. His own existence, on the other hand, declines to a subsidiary thing, a mere means. His mind needs to be constantly and vigorously occupied. Intellect is a magnitude of intensity, depth of learning, not of extensity, breadth of learning. And that is why one man can know more than 1,000. 1,000 fools do not make one wise man. And that's like what Galileo is at. Galileo says, intellect is like the horse race of a stallion. It's not like plow horse. It's not a question of volume. And that's why one stallion can outrun 1,000 plow horses. Okay, Schopenhauer continues. Okay, I'll just take my picture out of there. And this one's kind of funny. Like I said, he was jealous and pissed off because he couldn't get a job at the university. And he was the best professor in the whole country. University professors learn not for the sake of knowledge and insight, but to be able to chatter and give themselves airs. University professors, like he meant philosophy professors, are restricted in this way, are quite happy about the matter, for their real concern is to earn with credit an honest livelihood for themselves and also for their wives and children, and moreover to enjoy a certain prestige in the eyes of the public. On the other hand, the deeply stirred mind of the real philosopher, whose whole concern is to look for the key to our existence, as mysterious as it is precarious, is regarded by them as something mythological. Indeed, the man so affected appears to them to be obsessed by a monomania, for that a man could really be in dead earnest about philosophy does not as a rule occur to them, to anyone, least of all to a lecturer thereon. It has therefore been one of the rarest events for a genuine philosopher to at the same time be a lecturer in philosophy. I think that's funny that the philosophy professors are not philosophers, the art professors are not artists. Okay, so anyways, Schopenhauer continues. No difference in rank, position, or birth is so great as the gulf that separates the countless millions who use their head only in service of their belly. In other words, look upon it as an instrument of the will, and those very few and rare persons who have the courage to say, "No, it is too good for that. My head shall be active only in its own service. It shall try to comprehend the wondrous and varied spectacle of the world, and then reproduce it in some form, whether as art or as literature, that may answer to my character as an individual." These are the truly noble, the real noblesse oblige of the world. The others are serfs and go with the soil. The man endowed with great mental gifts leads apart from the individual life common to all a second life, purely of the intellect. He devotes himself to the constant increase, rectification, and extension, not of mere learning, but of real systematic knowledge and insight. It is thus a life which raises a man and sets him above fate and its changes. Always thinking, learning, experimenting, practicing his knowledge, the man soon comes to look upon this second life as his chief mode of existence, and his merely personal life as something subordinate, serving only to advance the ends higher than itself. An example of this type of independent, separate existence is furnished by Goethe. So that's Schopenhauer. Okay, we're almost done here. Oh, shit, I screwed up. We got one last page on Schopenhauer. True abolition of Latin as a universal language of learned men, together with the rise of provincialism, which attaches to national literatures, has been a real misfortune for the cause of knowledge in Europe. For it was chiefly through the medium of the Latin language that a learned public existed in Europe at all, a public to which every book that came out directly appealed. The number of minds in the whole of Europe that are capable of thinking and judging is small as it is, but when the audience is broken up and severed by differences of language, then the good that these minds can do is very much weakened. This is a great disadvantage, but a second and a worse one will follow, namely that the ancient languages will cease to be taught at all. Yeah, so he was ticked off back in early 1800s that Latin and Greek were no longer being taught and read, especially Latin. It was the national language of Europe, and it allowed scholars from everywhere to communicate. Okay, so he says, the neglect of these languages, Latin and Greek, is rapidly gaining ground in both France and Germany, and if it should really come to pass, then farewell humanity, farewell noble taste and high thinking. The age of barbarism will return in spite of railways, telegraphs, and balloons. We shall thus in the end lose one more advantage possessed by all our ancestors, for Latin is not only a key to the knowledge of Roman antiquity. Latin also directly opens up to us the Middle Ages in every country in Europe, and modern times as well, down to about 1750. The best recreation for the mind is to study the ancient classics. All right, so that's great stuff. Okay, just a little bit more from Schopenhauer. The thing treated can be important, whoever wrote it. The form, the particular character of the book, it depends on the person who wrote it. It is the way in which matters are treated, what is thought about them, that gives the book its value, and this comes from the author. What he's basically saying is, if the topic is a common topic that everybody has some familiarity with it, the author has to be really good to write anything unique or interesting. Whereas if the topic is something very, very, very unusual, like let's say that girl who escaped from North Korea and she tells her story is so unique, it doesn't matter if she could write well or talk well. Just because her story is so unique, it's going to be fascinating because it's completely new to us, relatively speaking. Okay, if the book is excellent and beyond comparison, so is its author. Where the matter is accessible to everyone, then everything will depend upon the form of the book. What is thought about the matter will give the book all the value it possesses. Here, only a really distinguished man will be able to produce anything worth reading, for the others will think nothing but what anyone else can think. A good author is fertile in ideas. He truly has something to say. While a man should, if possible, think like a great genius, he should talk the same language as everyone else. Only when a man is convinced of the truth and importance of his thoughts will he feel the enthusiasm necessary for the untiring effort to find the clearest, finest, and strongest expression for them. Okay, then one last quote by Schopenhauer. Exaggeration of every kind is essential to dramatic art. So that's Arthur Schopenhauer. He lived from 1788 to 1860, and he had a lot of good insights on how to write a good book. Hope that was useful.